The paper crinkled in Letitia Keating's hands as she stood before the entire town of Dusthaven, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, her knuckles white against the document that Harlan Shelby had just pressed into her palm with the satisfied smile of a man who had never once been told no in his 60 years of living. The document was a deed of purchase, not an offer, not a negotiation. A done deal, signed by the county commissioner himself, transferring ownership of the Dusthaven schoolhouse and its surrounding half-acre lot to the Shelby Cattle Company for the sum of $1,200. The ink was already dry. "You have until the 1st of November to vacate," Harlan Shelby said, his voice carrying the same flat authority he used when he told his ranch hands where to drive the cattle. He was a large man, barrel-chested and silver-haired, with sun-cracked skin and pale blue eyes that had long ago learned to look through people rather than at them. "That gives you 3 weeks, Miss Keating. More than generous, I would say." Letitia looked up from the document and found, over Harlan's broad shoulder, the face she had been avoiding looking for since she walked into the town hall meeting. Reuben Shelby stood by the far wall with his hat in both hands, turning the brim in slow circles, his jaw tight and his dark eyes locked on her with an expression that she could only describe as devastated. He had not known. She could see that clearly. Whatever his father had done, Reuben had not known, and the realization should have comforted her, but it did not, because knowing changed nothing. The school was sold. Her life in Dusthaven, the 23 children who came through that door every morning and counted on her, the 3 years she had spent building something real and good in this red dust town, all of it was being erased by a man who could not tolerate the idea that his son had fallen in love with a schoolteacher. "You can't do this," she said. Her voice was steady. She had promised herself it would be steady. Harlan tilted his head as though she had said something mildly interesting. "I believe the deed in your hand says otherwise. The children of this town need that school. The children of this town will survive. Children always do." He plucked his hat from the hook by the door. "Good evening, Miss Keating." He walked out. The room sat in silence except for the sound of the October wind pressing against the shuttered windows. Letitia looked down at the paper again. Then she looked at Reuben. He crossed the room in 6 strides and reached out as though he meant to take her hands, but stopped just short of touching her. Because a month ago she had told him that they needed to stop what was growing between them, and he had respected that. And now she could see in his face that the stopping was over, that whatever carefully constructed wall they had built between themselves had just been blown apart by his father's act of power. "Letitia," he said, low and close. "I swear to you I did not know." She believed him. She had always believed him. That was never the problem. The problem had started 11 weeks earlier, on a bright blue morning in late July, when the summer heat had not yet softened, and Letitia Keating had been standing on the front steps of the schoolhouse, trying to coax a rusted hinge into cooperating with a flathead screwdriver she had borrowed from the hardware store on Main Street. She had been in Dusthaven for 2.5 years by then, having come west from Richmond, Virginia, at the age of 26, after answering a notice in a Baptist mission newsletter, asking for certified educators willing to serve in frontier communities. She had a teaching certificate from the Richmond Normal School, a small leather trunk, a fierce and practical mind, and a burning need to be somewhere that was not Richmond, Virginia, where her engagement to a banker's son had ended in the particular humiliation of discovering that he had been corresponding romantically with her cousin for the duration of their year-long courtship. Dusthaven had been, in its own harsh and beautiful way, exactly what she needed. The town sat in the rolling hill country of central Texas, small enough that everyone knew everyone but large enough to have a doctor, a post office, a dry goods store, a saloon, 2 churches, and the one-room schoolhouse that Letitia had filled with maps and chalk drawings and the smell of paper and chalk dust and wood smoke from the iron stove in the corner. She had 23 students ranging in age from 5 to 14, children of ranchers and shopkeepers and the Mexican farm workers who lived along the creek. And she taught them reading and arithmetic and geography, and the history of a nation that had not yet decided what it owed any of them. She had been wrestling with the hinge for 10 minutes when she heard hooves, and looked up to see a rider coming down the main road at a walk, a tall man on a dark bay horse, both of them moving with the unhurried ease of people who belonged to the land they were crossing. He pulled up at the water trough at the edge of the schoolyard and swung down, and Letitia recognized him in the general way she recognized most of the ranching families around Dusthaven, as a Shelby, the baron's son, the one who actually worked the cattle rather than just owning them. She had seen him at the 4th of July dance and twice at Sunday services, but they had never spoken directly. He noticed her watching and touched his hat. "Morning." "Good morning," she said. He let his horse drink and then looked at the screwdriver in her hand and the hinge she had been fighting. "Trouble. The pin has rusted in place. I need to get it out or the door won't close properly when the weather turns cold." He tied the horse to the post, walked over and held out his hand. She passed him the screwdriver without thinking twice about it, and he crouched down and examined the hinge with the focused attention of someone who had spent his life solving mechanical problems in the field, where the nearest blacksmith might be 20 miles away. He turned the pin a degree at a time, working it loose with patience that she found she was quietly admiring, until it released with a soft click. "There," he said, and handed the screwdriver back. "Thank you, Mr. Shelby." He straightened, and up close she could see he was somewhere around 30, maybe a year or two either side, with a lean, weathered face and dark eyes that had something watchful and careful in them, the eyes of someone who thought before he spoke. "Reuben," he said. "Nobody calls me Mr. Shelby except bank tellers and people trying to sell me something." She smiled despite herself. "Letitia Keating." "I know who you are," he said, and there was nothing presumptuous in the way he said it, only the plain acknowledgement of a man who lived in a small town. "My foreman's youngest daughter is in your class. He says she talks about school more than she talks about horses, which in his family is about the highest praise you can earn." She laughed, a genuine laugh, the kind she had not expected to give that morning. "That would be Rosa Fuentes. She is extraordinary with fractions." He nodded, clearly pleased by this, and then did something she did not expect. Instead of tipping his hat and riding on, as any ranching man on a busy morning would reasonably do, he said, "I've been meaning to ask someone at the school if they would accept a donation of books. My mother had a collection before she passed. Most of them are sitting in a crate in the ranch house study. History, some novels, a couple of atlases. Seems a waste to leave them there." Letitia felt the particular alertness of a woman who had built a school library from almost nothing and was always hungry for more materials. "I would be deeply grateful for that," she said. "What a generous thought. I can bring them by later this week if that suits." "It suits very well." He touched his hat again, untied the horse, and rode on. She stood at the door she could now close properly and watched him go and told herself it was simply gratitude that made her watch that long. He came by Thursday afternoon with a wooden crate balanced across his saddle. There were 31 books in it, and Letitia sat on the schoolhouse steps with him for 2 hours going through them, while the late afternoon light turned the dust in the yard gold. And they talked about everything from Ulysses Grant to the irrigation problems along the Guadalupe River. And she discovered that he had read more widely than she would have expected and thought more carefully than most men she had met, and that he laughed at the right moments and went quiet at the right ones too. He came back the following Tuesday to fix a section of the fence around the schoolyard that had buckled after a heavy rain. She had not asked him to. He had simply noticed it as he rode past and stopped. She brought him water from the school's cistern and they talked while he worked. And she learned that his mother had been the one who taught him to read, sitting on the porch of the ranch house with a King James Bible and a volume of Dickens, and that her death 7 years ago from typhoid fever had left a particular silence in the Shelby household that his father had filled with work and acquisition and the building of an empire. "He is not a cruel man," Reuben said, driving a nail with 2 clean strokes. "He is not even an unkind one exactly. He is a man who decided a long time ago that he knew what mattered, and everything that falls outside that understanding he simply cannot see. What does he think matters? Land, cattle, legacy, a pause, the right kind of marriage for his son." She heard the particular weight in that last sentence and chose not to ask the obvious follow-up question. Instead she said, "And what do you think matters?" He set the hammer down and looked at her directly with those careful dark eyes. "Increasingly," he said, "I am revising my answer to that question." She felt warmth rise in her face and looked away at the flat horizon where the cedar trees met the sky, and she told herself firmly that this was a path that led nowhere uncomplicated, and she had come to Texas specifically to build an uncomplicated life. But August came, and with it the evening community readings she had organized at the schoolhouse, where anyone in town was welcome to come and hear a chapter read aloud from whatever book she had chosen, and Reuben Shelby came to every one of them. He sat in the back on a bench that was slightly too small for him, and listened with the same concentrated attention he gave everything, and sometimes in the middle of a passage, she would look up from the page and find his eyes on her, not the book, and her voice would falter almost imperceptibly before she caught it. The first time he walked her home from one of those evenings, it was simply because it was late and the road was dark and he was going in the same direction. The second time, she understood that he had stayed later than he needed to in order to have reason to walk beside her. The third time they had been walking for 10 minutes before either of them said anything, and then they both started talking at the same moment and laughed, and he said, "You first," and she said, "No, you," and he stopped walking and turned to face her on the dark road with the stars enormous overhead and said, "Letitia, I need to say something that you are entirely free to tell me is too much." She said nothing. Her heart was very loud. "I think about you more than is reasonable," he said. "I have tried to stop and I have been unsuccessful. I am not asking you for anything. I just thought you deserved to know that I see you clearly, and I think you are the most remarkable woman I have met in my life, and I understand if that changes things between us." She looked at him for a long moment and then said, very quietly, "It doesn't change things, except that I think you should know you are not the only one who has been struggling with reason." He exhaled slowly, like a man who had been holding his breath for weeks. "Then what do we do?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Your father is a very powerful man. He is. And I am a schoolteacher with no family in this county and no land and no money beyond my salary. I know. So, he said and smiled, and the smile undid something in her chest. "We could start with Sunday dinner at the hotel, in plain sight of the whole town, and see what happens." She should have said no. Everything logical told her to say no. "All right," she said. They had 6 Sundays. 6 extraordinary, quietly joyful Sundays of dinner at the Dusthaven Hotel with its white tablecloths and its slightly too warm dining room, where they talked and laughed and argued about history and ranching, and the proper function of government and the ethics of the cattle industry's treatment of Mexican workers, which was a topic on which Letitia had sharp opinions and Reuben listened carefully, and she thought, genuinely recalibrated. She learned that he rose at 4 in the morning and could identify any breed of cattle at 200 yards, and had once ridden 3 days straight to bring a sick ranch hand to a doctor in San Antonio, and had never told his father he did it because it would have been seen as sentimentality. She learned that his hidden wound was not just his mother's death but the slow discovery over the years since, that the grief had turned his father not toward his son, but away from everything soft, as though love itself had been proven a liability. After the 3rd Sunday dinner, walking back through town in the blue evening, he took her hand, just her hand. He held it carefully, like something valuable, and she held his back, and neither of them spoke about it, and it was, she thought, one of the most honest moments she had experienced in her adult life. After the 5th Sunday, Harlan Shelby rode into town on his enormous black horse and found his son walking hand in hand with Letitia Keating past the dry goods store. He looked at them from horseback with an expression that was not angry so much as calculative, the look of a man running figures. He tipped his hat at Letitia with cold courtesy and said to Reuben, "When you have a moment, son, nothing more." He rode on. That night, whatever conversation passed between the Shelby men at the ranch house left Reuben arriving at the schoolhouse the next morning looking like someone had taken something from him. He stood in the doorway before school hours with his hat in his hands, the same posture she would later see him adopt at the town hall, and told her quietly that his father had said what she already knew his father would say, that this was unsuitable, that a cattle baron's son had responsibilities, that there were families in the county whose daughters would make appropriate matches, that a schoolteacher, however admirable her qualities, was not a foundation for legacy. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said that I was 31 years old and had been running his operation for the last 8 years and that my personal life was my own to determine." "How did he take that?" "About as well as you would expect." She pressed her hands together. She had known this was coming. "Reuben, do not say what you are about to say. I have to say it. I have 23 children who depend on this school, and this school depends on the goodwill of this town, and this town depends in large measure on the economic reach of the Shelby Cattle Company. If your father decides to make an enemy of me, the consequences fall on the children." His jaw tightened. "He would not do that. You said yourself that he cannot see anything that falls outside his understanding of what matters. A schoolteacher standing between him and his son's legacy falls entirely outside that understanding." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a meadowlark was singing in the cedar tree beside the fence, and the morning was heartbreakingly beautiful in the way that Texas mornings could be in late September, the air just beginning to carry the first hint of coolness. "What are you asking me?" he said. "I am asking you to give me time to think," she said, "and in the meantime I think we should not be seen together. Letitia, please." Her voice was controlled but just barely. "Please, Reuben. Let me think." He nodded once and put his hat on and left, and she went inside and stood at the chalkboard where she had written the day's arithmetic problems in careful letters, and felt the particular grief of a woman who had opened a door she had known better than to open. For 3 weeks she kept her distance and kept teaching and kept telling herself she had made the sensible choice. And then Harlan Shelby bought the school. Now Letitia stood in the empty town hall after the meeting had broken up, and Reuben was still there, and the deed was still in her hand, and everything she had tried to protect by stepping back had been destroyed anyway by a man who did not need her cooperation to remove her from his son's path. He had simply bought the ground from under her. "I need to understand exactly what this means legally," she said, setting the deed on the table and spreading it flat. Her mind was working now, the same methodical way it worked when a problem in arithmetic refused to resolve itself, looking for the angle that revealed the error. Reuben came and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and read the document over her shoulder. "He bought it from the county commissioner," he said. "Barton. Commissioner Barton was elected on a platform of expanding educational access," she said, and there was iron in her voice now. "He campaigned on it 2 years ago. Half the town voted for him on that basis." "Money changes platforms," Reuben said bitterly. "The schoolhouse was built with a public education charter under Texas state law in 1879. I do not know if a county commissioner can simply sell it without a full board vote." She straightened and looked at him. "I need to talk to a lawyer." "The nearest lawyer is in Careville, 2 hours by horse." "Then I will go to Careville. I will take you." She looked at him. "Reuben, stop making decisions on my behalf about what is safe for me," he said, and there was no anger in it, only a kind of bedrock firmness that she had not heard from him before. "My father has just made this a fight. I would like to be on the right side of it. Let me help you." She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded. They rode to Careville the following morning on 2 horses, early enough that the mist was still sitting in the low places along the road. It was a strange and oddly peaceful journey given everything that surrounded it. the two of them riding side by side through the hill country with the cedar and live oak pressing close on either side, and the red road stretching ahead, talking sometimes and quiet sometimes. And Letitia found herself thinking that this was what it would be like if the world were simpler, if he were not who he was, and she were not who she was, and an old man's need for control were not hanging over everything like a storm. "Tell me something true," she said, somewhere along the middle stretch of the ride. He considered. "I have known since the third Sunday dinner that I wanted to marry you." "I have not said so because I did not want to frighten you." She felt the ground shift slightly under the horse's hooves, or at least it felt that way. "That is very true. Your turn." She was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "I have known since the night you told me you had been struggling with reason that you were the best man I had ever met, and I have been frightened by that ever since." He looked at her. "Why frightened?" "Because the best things are the most catastrophic when they are taken away," she said. "And I have had things taken away." He didn't press her on that, and she was grateful, and they rode on in the kind of silence that has understanding in it. The lawyer's name was Gerald Oates, and his office was on the second floor of a building on Careville's Main Street, above a pharmacy. He was a lean, precise man of about 50 with wire-rimmed spectacles and the permanently slightly overwhelmed expression of a man whose practice had expanded faster than his staff. He read the deed Letitia brought him with careful attention, flipping pages back and forth, and then sat back and looked at her over his glasses. "The commissioner had the technical authority to sell county-owned property under Texas statute," he said, "but a public education charter creates encumbrances on that authority. This charter," he tapped the separate document Letitia had brought, the original 1879 charter of the Dusthaven School, specifies that the property was designated in perpetuity for educational use within the community of Dusthaven. That language is enforceable. "Can the sale be challenged?" Letitia asked. "It can be challenged on the grounds that the sale violates the charter's perpetuity clause. The argument would be that Commissioner Barton did not have the legal authority to alienate the property for non-educational purposes. If the Shelby Cattle Company intends to use the land for anything other than a school, the challenge has merit." "What does the process look like?" "You file a challenge with the district court. A judge reviews. It could take months." He paused. "It would also be helpful to have the broader community on record in opposition. A petition, signatures from townspeople, letters to the district judge." "I can do that," Letitia said. "I should also advise you," Oates said carefully, glancing at Reuben, "that opposing the Shelby family in Kerr County is not without risk. They have considerable influence." "I am aware," Letitia said. "And you intend to proceed?" "I intend to proceed." He nodded slowly. "Then I will draft the challenge document for you to review. I can have it ready by Friday." They rode back to Dusthaven in the late afternoon with the sun dropping toward the hill country ridgeline and painting everything amber and rose, and Reuben said, "I want you to know that whatever my father tries to do, I will not let him harm you or the school without a fight." "I know," she said, "and I want you to know that I have been thinking about something since last night." "What is that?" "The ranch will be mine one day. All of it. The land, the cattle, the company. My father is not a young man and his heart has been troubling him." He paused. "When that day comes, the Shelby Cattle Company will not be in the business of displacing schools." She looked at him. "That day is not today." "No, but today matters because of what it becomes. I want you to know that the future I am thinking about is one where you are standing in it beside me." The amber light was very warm on his face, and she thought that she had spent 3 weeks being sensible and careful and afraid, and that none of it had stopped the thing from happening, the thing she had been trying to prevent, the falling, the deep and irreversible kind. "Reuben," she said, "you do not have to answer that now. I know." She looked at the road ahead. "Ask me again when we have won." He smiled, and it was the best smile she had ever seen, wide and unguarded. "Deal." Back in Dusthaven, Letitia went to work. She began the petition that evening at the kitchen table of her rented room at the widow Hanson's boarding house, writing out the language carefully, something that stated clearly what the school meant to the families of the town, and what the 1879 charter had promised them. She kept it factual and specific, naming each of the 23 students by name, naming their parents, citing the charter language Lawyer Oates had pointed out to her. Then she went door to door. It was slower and harder than she had hoped. Harlan Shelby employed, directly or indirectly, nearly 40% of the working population of Dusthaven. His ranch hand payroll alone sustained a dozen families. She went to the Fuentes household first because she knew them well and trusted them, and Rosa's father Pedro signed without hesitation, his broad hand pressing the pen firmly. "That school is the only reason my daughter knows how to read past her name," he said. "Mr. Shelby can buy the land, but he cannot buy what was taught there." His wife Clara added her name below his. The blacksmith, Ed Tanner, signed. The hotel owner, Margaret Greer, signed. The doctor, Samuel Whitmore, signed with particular conviction. "An educated population is a healthy population," he said, which Letitia thought was exactly right. But several others, the feed store owner, 3 of the ranching families, 2 of the men who operated the cattle pens on the eastern edge of town, declined with apologetic eyes and the look of people who knew which side of their bread the butter was on. She did not blame them. She understood economic fear, but she was disappointed, and she let herself feel it for exactly 1 evening before getting back up the next morning and continuing. By the end of the week, she had 31 signatures. Dusthaven had a population of approximately 200 adults. 31 was not a majority, but Lawyer Oates had told her she needed community opposition on record, not a democratic referendum, and 31 was enough to constitute meaningful opposition. What she did not anticipate was Grace Pelham. Grace Pelham was 71 years old, small and sharp as a hawk, and she had been in Dusthaven since before it was called Dusthaven, since the time it had been a loose collection of homesteads along a creek bend with no name at all. She had come west from Missouri in 1848 with her husband Thomas, who had built the first permanent structure in town, before dying of a snakebite in 1861, and she had stayed and watched the town grow up around her like a child she had raised. She owned nothing any more of economic consequence, just her small house and a garden, but she carried a weight in the town that could not be measured in dollars. Grace came to Letitia on Thursday morning, appearing at the schoolhouse door during morning recess with a cane and an expression of considered purpose. "I want to talk to you," she said. "Of course, Mrs. Pelham, come in." Grace sat in the teacher's chair with the unself-conscious authority of someone who had long ago stopped worrying about what belonged to her and looked at Letitia steadily. "I have been watching this business with Harlan Shelby," she said, "and I want to tell you something about the history of this school that you may not know." Letitia sat down on a student's bench across from her. "Please." "When this school was chartered in 1879, Grace said, "the land it sits on was not county land. It was privately donated by my husband's estate, because Thomas believed to his bones that a community without a school was not a community. My husband donated that land to the public charter on the specific condition that it would remain a school in perpetuity." She paused. "The original deed of donation is in my strongbox at home. I have had it for 20 years, and I have never needed to produce it because nobody has ever tried to take this school before." Letitia stared at her. "Mrs. Pelham, that document would mean the county had no legal right to sell the land at all. The original private donation with a perpetuity condition supersedes the county's authority to alienate the property." "That is what I have been told," Grace said calmly. "I consulted with a lawyer in San Antonio many years ago, after Barton's predecessor made some noises about converting the land to other purposes. He confirmed my interpretation. Will you share that document with my lawyer?" Grace placed both hands on her cane. "I came here specifically to do that. I am 81 years old, and I have watched good things in this town be eaten up by ambition and money more times than I care to count. I will not watch it happen again while I still have breath and a functional memory." She stood. "Come to my house this evening. I will have everything ready." Letitia stood too and took the old woman's hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with everything she had. She sent word to Reuben through Rosa Fuentes that afternoon, a simple note that said, "The case has changed significantly. Meet me at Hanson's boarding house at 7 this evening." It was direct and perhaps not entirely proper, but they had long since passed the point where propriety was the main consideration. He came at 7 on the dot, hat in hand, and she sat him down in the parlor of the boarding house, where Widow Hanson tactfully withdrew to the kitchen, and told him about Grace Pelham and the original deed, and what Lawyer Oates had said about perpetuity conditions. Reuben listened to all of it without interrupting and then sat back and looked at her with a complicated expression. "This is going to embarrass my father considerably," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "it is. He will not take that gracefully. I expect not." He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. Then he looked up. "Good," he said. "He deserves to be embarrassed. What he did was wrong, not just toward you, toward this town. He used his money to take something from people who had less because he wanted to control something he had no right to control." A pause. "I need you to know that I will be standing with you when Oates files this challenge. Publicly. Your father will cut you out. Possibly. I have been thinking about that." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "The ranch is entailed, which means he cannot actually disinherit me and leave everything to a stranger without my consent, because of how my grandfather set up the estate documents in 1861. The lawyers looked at all of this when my mother died, and the question came up about what would happen if my father remarried and had other children. The short version is that I have more legal protection than my father has probably realized." She studied him. "You have thought about this more carefully than I expected." "I've been awake for approximately 4 days," he said, with a wryness that did not quite conceal the exhaustion underneath it. "I think a great deal when I cannot sleep." She felt a wave of something warm and protective move through her. She reached out and touched the back of his hand just briefly, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed like that for a moment in the parlor lamplight. "We are going to win this," she said. "We are," he said. "And then I am going to ask you something." She squeezed his hand once and let go. "Let's win first." She rode to Careville on Saturday with Grace Pelham's original deed document, a notarized copy Grace had made along with a signed affidavit, and presented them to Gerald Oates, who read them with growing satisfaction and looked up at her over his spectacles and said, "Miss Keating, this changes everything." "So I had hoped," she said. The original deed of donation from the Pelham estate contains an explicit perpetuity clause with the specific condition that the land be used for educational purposes, and crucially, it contains a reverter clause, which means that if the land is ever converted to non-educational use, ownership reverts to the Pelham estate's designated heirs. That heir is currently Mrs. Grace Pelham herself. He set the documents down. The county never actually had free and clear title to this land. They have been holding it in trust for the educational charter. Commissioner Barton sold something he did not have the right to sell, which means the sale to the Shelby Cattle Company is void, Letitia said. "That is my professional opinion, yes. I will draft the challenge accordingly. I would recommend we also file a complaint with the Texas State Commissioner of Education, because the Commissioner's office has oversight authority over public education charters and has the power to intervene directly. File everything you can," she said. She rode back to Dusthaven feeling, for the first time since the night of the town hall meeting, something that was not quite hope, but was the structural scaffolding of hope. The hill country around her was showing its first thin wash of autumn color, the sumac turning red along the creek banks, and the air had that clean edge to it that promised that the brutal Texas summer was finally stepping back. When she got back to town, she found Reuben waiting at the edge of the road as though he had known she was coming, though she realized he had simply been watching the road from town all afternoon. He rode out to meet her. "How did it go?" she told him. She watched his face change as she laid out what Oates had said: the reverter clause, the void sale, the state commissioner complaint. The exhaustion eased slightly and something harder and cleaner took its place. "He's going to hear about this," Reuben said. "He likely already knows something is happening. He has people who keep him informed." "Let him hear," she said. "He bought something he had no right to buy. That is not a comfortable position to be defending publicly." Reuben nodded slowly. "I am going to go home tonight and talk to him." She looked at him sharply. "Reuben, not to negotiate, to give him the chance to do the right thing himself before the courts do it for him." His voice was level. "He is still my father. I owe him that." She thought about it and nodded. "All right, but be careful." "I am always careful," he said. "It is my most reliable quality." Despite everything, she laughed. The conversation between Reuben and Harlan Shelby that evening at the ranch house was one that would, in later years, be described by Reuben as the most important and most difficult of his life. He found his father in the study, the large room at the back of the house, where Harlan had spent the last 2 decades making every significant decision about the empire he had built, surrounded by ledgers and maps and the portraits of his father and grandfather, both men who had come west with nothing and built something through the specific combination of vision, labor, and the refusal to acknowledge any obstacle as permanent. Reuben sat down across the desk from his father without being invited to, which was itself a statement, and said, "The school's original deed of donation contains a perpetuity clause and a reverter clause. Commissioner Barton did not have the right to sell it. The sale is void." Harlan looked at him without expression for a long moment. "Who found that?" "Grace Pelham has the original documents." A pause. Harlan's jaw tightened slightly. "Barton should have checked." "He should have," Reuben agreed. "But the larger point is that what you attempted to do was wrong, regardless of whether it would have succeeded legally. You tried to buy a woman out of my life. You tried to take a school away from 24 children who have done nothing to you. I tried to protect you from an unsuitable." "She is not unsuitable." Reuben's voice stayed level, but there was something in it now that Harlan clearly recognized, because he stopped talking. "She is the most capable and intelligent and principled person I have met in my life. What makes her unsuitable in your estimation is that she has no money, no land, and no family name in this county. Those are your criteria. They are not mine." Harlan looked at his son for a long time. Outside the window, the October wind was moving through the live oaks and the ranch hand's bunkhouse lights were warm against the dark. "Your mother," Harlan said finally, and then stopped. Reuben waited. "Your mother was not who my father thought she should marry either," Harlan said, and something shifted in his face, something old and deeply buried that he was clearly not comfortable having above ground. "My father thought she was too gentle, too educated, not practical enough for ranch life. He was quiet. He was wrong. She was the best thing that ever happened to this family." "Yes," Reuben said carefully, "she was." Another silence, longer this time. "The sale cannot stand," Harlan said at last. Not a question, a statement, the voice of a man recalculating. "No, it cannot." Harlan was quiet for a full minute. Then he said, with the exhausted abruptness of a man who hated admitting defeat but hated protracted loss more, "I will withdraw the purchase. Tell Barton to reverse the transaction." Reuben let out a careful breath. "That is the right decision. Do not patronize me, son." "I am not. I mean it genuinely." He stood. "I intend to ask Letitia Keating to marry me. I expect you to receive her with the same respect you would give any woman I brought into this family." Harlan looked at him. His pale eyes moved through something complex and then settled into something less combative than resignation, but not entirely different from it. "She had better be as capable as you say." "She is considerably more so," Reuben said. "You will see that for yourself." He left his father to his ledgers and his thoughts and rode back toward town, and the night air was cool and full of stars, and he felt, for the first time in weeks, that he could breathe properly. The morning after Reuben's conversation with his father, Commissioner Barton appeared at the door of Letitia's schoolhouse with his hat in his hands, and the sheepish expression of a man whose recent decisions had caught up with him rather faster than he had expected. He informed her that due to a review of the title documents, the county had determined that the sale of the schoolhouse property to the Shelby Cattle Company had been conducted in error, and the transaction was being reversed. He would be reimbursing Mr. Shelby his $1,200, and the property would remain under its original public education charter. He also said, with the specific discomfort of a man who knew he had done something wrong and was not quite ready to apologize for it directly, that there would be no further attempts by the county to alienate the school property. Letitia thanked him with precise courtesy and closed the door. She stood in the empty schoolroom for a moment in the morning light, with the chalk dust and the smell of books and the children's drawings pinned along the top of the walls, the 23 small artifacts of 23 small lives she had been trusted with. The sun came through the east window in a long yellow stripe across the plank floor. The iron hinge she had been wrestling with on the morning she first really spoke to Reuben Shelby held the door firm and true. She sat down at her desk and pressed her hands flat on the wood and breathed. She had won. The school was safe. The children were safe. Later that afternoon, when school let out and the yard was briefly loud with running feet and then went quiet, she was erasing the day's lessons from the chalkboard when she heard boots on the step and looked up. Reuben stood in the doorway with the afternoon sun behind him. He was not wearing his work clothes, she noticed. He was wearing the dark coat he wore to church, and his hat was in his hands again, that familiar posture, but his face was different from every other time she had seen him in that posture. It was clear and open and stripped of all the careful wariness she had come to know. "I heard," she said. "Barton came this morning. I know, he stepped inside. I wanted to hear it from you, how you were." "Relieved," she said honestly. "Tired, very glad." He nodded. He crossed the room slowly, stepping around the row of small benches, until he was standing close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. "I told you," he said, "that I would ask you something when we had won." Her hands tightened slightly on the eraser. "You did." "I'm a man of my word." He looked at her steadily. "Letitia, I have loved you since approximately the second Tuesday in August, if I am being precise about it. I want to spend the rest of my life in a world where you are my home and I am yours. I want to watch you teach and argue with me about irrigation and read to me in the evenings." He paused. "I am aware that my father is a complicated part of that picture, and I am working on it. I am aware that the world is not simple, and I do not expect you to agree to it because it is simple. I am asking you because it is true and I cannot pretend otherwise." Another pause. "Will you marry me?" Letitia Keating, who had ridden west from Richmond with a leather trunk and a teaching certificate and a determination to build something real, stood in the schoolroom she had fought for and looked at the man who had fought alongside her, and felt the last of the carefully maintained distance between herself and the future dissolve completely. "Yes," she said, "I will." He stepped forward and took both her hands, and for a moment they just stood there with their hands folded together in the chalk-dusted afternoon air, and it was the simplest and most complete moment she had experienced in longer than she could remember. Then she laughed, a bright released sound, and he laughed too, and he pulled her in and she let him, and she rested her forehead against his jaw and felt his arms settle around her with the particular care of someone who understood exactly what they were holding. The engagement was announced formally at the November community supper, which was held in the town hall with trestle tables and Widow Hanson's famous venison stew, and was attended by approximately 130 people. Letitia had not been certain until the moment it was announced how the town would respond, whether Harlan Shelby's shadow would make people cautious, whether there would be the particular Texas politeness that was indistinguishable from coldness. But Margaret Greer from the hotel clapped first, loudly, and Pedro Fuentes put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled, and then the applause moved through the room and it was warm and genuine, and Letitia, standing beside Reuben with her hand in his, felt something she recognized as belonging. Harlan Shelby attended the supper. He sat at the end of one of the tables with two of his ranch managers and ate his stew and said nothing particular about the announcement, but he did not leave, and at the end of the evening he approached Letitia where she was standing near the door and looked at her with those pale, calculating eyes and said, "My son tells me you are formidable." "I try to be," she said. "He is not wrong about much," Harlan said. He did not extend his hand or offer congratulations, but there was something in his face that was not hostility, and Letitia understood that from a man like Harlan Shelby, absence of hostility was a significant offering. "I love your son," she said. "I intend to love him well." Harlan nodded once and walked away, and Reuben appeared at her elbow and said quietly, "That went better than I expected." "I agree," she said. "Give him time. I have been giving him time for 31 years. A bit more will not kill either of us." They were married in December on the 18th in the First Baptist Church of Dusthaven, Texas, which was a small white clapboard building on the east side of Main Street with a bell that you could hear from the Shelby Ranch on a still morning. Letitia wore a dress of dark blue wool because it was December and she was practical, with a white collar and her hair pinned up under a small hat with a single cream ribbon. She carried a spray of dried rosemary because the florist in Careville had explained that winter weddings in the hill country could not count on fresh flowers, but rosemary, she said, was for remembrance, and Letitia thought that was a fine thing to carry. Reuben wore his best suit, and the expression of a man who had got precisely what he had hoped for against all the odds that had been stacked against it. And when she came down the aisle, short as it was in that small church, he looked at her with such uncomplicated love that several people in the congregation who had not planned to cry found themselves needing their handkerchiefs. Grace Pelham sat in the front pew on Letitia's side of the church, small and straight-backed and satisfied, her cane resting against the pew beside her. The Fuentes family filled most of 2 rows, Pedro and Clara and their children, including Rosa, who had pinned wildflowers into her hair for the occasion. Margaret Greer was there, and Dr. Whitmore, and Ed Tanner the blacksmith, and somewhere in the back, Letitia could feel rather than see that Harlan Shelby had come and was sitting in the last row, which was the Harlan Shelby equivalent of standing in the front. The Reverend Caleb Marsh read from Corinthians, the passage about love that everyone chooses for weddings, but that Letitia had always thought was chosen too casually, because it was in fact a demanding and rigorous description of what love required, the bearing of all things and the enduring of all things. And as she listened to the words, she thought that they had already begun practicing that, she and Reuben, in the weeks of standing firm and fighting for what was right. And that gave the words a weight they would not otherwise have had. When Reverend Marsh asked if anyone knew of any reason this union should not proceed, the church was pleasantly, conclusively silent. They said their vows clearly and held each other's hands firmly, and when Reverend Marsh pronounced them married and Reuben kissed her, the whole church erupted in a sound that bounced off the painted walls and rang up into the rafters. And outside someone, probably Pedro Fuentes, fired his pistol into the air twice, which was either a celebration or a warning depending on your disposition, and Letitia thought it was probably both at once, which was exactly right for a Texas wedding. The reception was in the town hall, which had been decorated with cedar branches and ribboned by Margaret Greer and the ladies of both churches, and the stew and cornbread and dried apple pie came from a dozen different kitchens, and someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had brought a guitar, and the dancing started before the food was finished. Reuben was not, he admitted freely, a talented dancer, but he was willing, which Letitia had always found to be more valuable than talent, and they moved through the room together and were claimed by various townspeople for various conversations, and then found each other again at the edge of the dancing with the particular ease of 2 people who were already becoming each other's natural reference point. At some point late in the evening, she noticed Harlan Shelby talking to Grace Pelham in the corner, the 2 oldest forces in the room, and from the set of both their faces, it appeared to be a conversation of substance. She could not hear what they were saying. She watched them for a moment and then turned back to her husband, who had appeared beside her with 2 cups of cider, and thought that whatever was being said in that corner, the town was rearranging itself around the new facts of the world, which was what towns did, and it would be all right. They moved into the ranch house in the new year, after Reuben had spent December clearing out and refurnishing a suite of rooms in the east wing that his mother had once used as a private sitting room and studio. He had been methodical and careful about it, asking Letitia at every stage what she wanted, and the result was a set of rooms that were both recognizably part of the old ranch house and recognizably hers, with bookshelves that reached the ceiling and a writing desk by the east window and a braided rug in burgundy, and cream that she had found at a dry goods auction in Careville. She continued teaching. This had not been negotiable, and Reuben had not attempted to negotiate it. She rode from the ranch house to the school each morning on a steady brown mare named Prudence that Reuben had selected for her on the grounds that her own horse, a borrowed animal she had been using for 2 years, was overdue for retirement, and that Prudence was safe and reliable. Letitia suspected he had also chosen Prudence partly because she was the most beautiful horse in the stable, which she found endearing. Living at the Shelby Ranch was a different world from the boarding house. The scale of it took some getting used to, the sheer amount of land and labor and infrastructure, the constant movement of cattle and horses and men, the logistics of running an operation that fed and employed so many people. She found herself applying her organizational mind to some of it without being asked, noticing places where the record-keeping was inefficient, or where information was not flowing clearly between the ranch foreman and the house accounts, and making quiet suggestions that Reuben listened to with interest and implemented where they made sense. Harlan watched this. He said nothing about it for 2 months. Then one morning in February he appeared in the doorway of the study where Letitia was reviewing some account books because Reuben had asked her to look at a discrepancy in the winter feed supply records and said, without preamble, "The accounts for the East Range have been underrecorded for 3 seasons." "I noticed," she said. "Rodriguez is the foreman out there. He is not dishonest, he is simply disorganized. I can see that from the pattern." Disorganized recording has a different signature from deliberate falsification. Harlan looked at her for a moment. "What would you recommend? A simpler logging format that he can maintain daily rather than in weekly summary. Fewer aggregations, more granular daily records. It reduces the compounding of small errors." He was quiet for a moment. "That is sensible," he said and walked away. It was not an apology. It was not a declaration of acceptance. But it was Harlan Shelby asking her opinion and calling it sensible, and over the following weeks he began, gradually, to include her in certain conversations about the ranch that he had previously held with Reuben alone. She was careful not to overreach and careful not to undersell herself, and she thought that they were, very slowly, building something that might one day resemble mutual respect. The spring brought new growth in every sense. The cedar and live oak along the creek put out fresh leaves, pale and almost fragile before they thickened into the deep summer green. The cattle moved up to the higher pastures for the season, and the whole rhythm of the ranch shifted toward the expansive busyness of spring roundup. Letitia taught through it all and came home each evening to a house that was becoming genuinely hers, and to a husband who brought her coffee in the morning and argued with her cheerfully about everything and kissed her, as though he meant it every single time. In April, she told him she was expecting a child. He went very still in the way that she had come to recognize as his response to news of great magnitude, the processing stillness, the gathering of self before the full response came out. Then he looked at her with an expression that she did not have an adequate word for, something made of joy and astonishment and a kind of reverence that she felt might undo her entirely. "Are you certain?" he said. "Dr. Whitmore confirmed it yesterday. Early November, he estimates." Reuben crossed the room and took her face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment and then held her, carefully and completely, and she felt him breathe. "I need a minute," he said into her hair. "Take whatever you need," she said. "I am very happy," he said. "I want you to know that I am very, very happy." "I know," she said. "I can tell." He laughed, and she felt it through his whole chest, and she thought that she had traveled a very long way from Richmond, Virginia, and that every mile of it had been exactly worth it. She told Grace Pelham, who cried without embarrassment and then said briskly, "Good. This town needs children who have been raised by someone with sense." She told the Fuentes family, who celebrated with the fullness of people who understood that life's good moments needed to be properly received. And Reuben told his father. Harlan's response, by all accounts, was to go into the study and close the door and remain there for an hour. When he emerged, he found Reuben on the porch and said, "I hope it's a boy." "Either way," Reuben said. "Either way," Harlan agreed, after a moment, with the specific weight of a man who had begun to revise something important. He went to find Letitia in the kitchen, where she was helping the cook plan the week's meals, and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, which was not a posture she had ever seen him take, and said, "Reuben told me. I am glad." He cleared his throat. "You should rest more. The road to town is rough." "I am fine," she said. "You should rest more," he said again, and left the kitchen. And she thought that for Harlan Shelby, that was approximately equivalent to an embrace. The summer passed warm and full. Letitia taught until June and then yielded to Dr. Whitmore's advice and the considerable logistical difficulty of riding a horse in the third trimester, delegating the schoolroom temporarily to Miss Agnes Fry, a young woman of 20 who had come to Dusthaven with her widowed mother and had 2 years of normal school training. Letitia spent the months of July, August, and September reviewing her curriculum, expanding the school's library with a new order of books from a publisher in Austin, corresponding with the Texas State Commissioner of Education about improving the certification requirements for frontier teachers, and occasionally, against everyone's advice, rearranging the furniture in her study. She also spent considerable time on the porch of the ranch house in the evenings with Reuben, watching the sky turn colors over the hill country and talking about everything. She was reading him Dickens, which felt right given the origins of the thing, and he was reading her a history of the cattle trails of Texas that he had borrowed from a ranching association library. And sometimes they read to each other, and sometimes they just sat in the companionable warm quiet that was, she thought, one of the best things a life could hold. On the 3rd of November, 1883, their son arrived. Dr. Whitmore was present, and Reuben was in the room throughout, which was not the typical arrangement, but was absolutely not negotiable as far as both of them were concerned. The labor was long, and Letitia was not stoic about it, which she had warned Reuben about in advance, telling him plainly that she did not believe in performing serenity during significant physical pain, and he had said he would not expect it. The baby was healthy and strong and very loud. He had Reuben's dark eyes and Letitia's firm, expressive mouth, a combination that Reuben said meant he would either be a leader of men or a lawyer, and Letitia said that was the same thing. They named him Thomas, for Thomas Pelham, because it seemed right, and because when Letitia proposed it, Grace Pelham's face had done something so quietly, profoundly moved, that it settled the question entirely. Harlan met his grandson the morning after the birth. He came into the room quietly, which was unusual for a man who usually moved through spaces as though he owned them, which he largely did, and stood at the bedside and looked at Thomas in Letitia's arms. She watched something happen in the old man's face that she had only glimpsed before in fragments: the grief and the love and the time that had passed, the wife he had lost, and the years he had spent armoring himself against all of it, and the small new face that was looking up at him with the indifferent intensity of the newly born. Harlan reached out and touched the back of the baby's hand with one finger. Thomas's fingers, with the reflexive grip of the newborn, closed around his grandfather's. Harlan Shelby sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed and did not say anything for a long time. "He has your eyes," Letitia said, to give him something. "He has Reuben's eyes," Harlan said, his voice slightly rough. "Yes," she said. He looked at her then directly with those pale eyes and said, "I owe you an apology for what I tried to do last autumn." She had not expected it this directly. "Yes," she said, "you do," he nodded. "I am giving it." "Then I am accepting it," she said, and meant it. She was not a woman who held things when they were no longer necessary to hold. He looked back at the baby. "What is his name?" "Thomas," she said. Harlan's jaw moved slightly. He glanced up at her with a look that was questioning. "For Thomas Pelham," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him understanding the depth of that choice. Thomas Pelham had built this town. His donation had saved the school. His wife's document had undone Harlan's own attempt to destroy what the Pelhams had built. The name was, among other things, a history lesson. Harlan was smart enough to see that. "Appropriate," he said finally, and it was both acceptance and acknowledgement, and she thought that was enough. Reuben appeared in the doorway with coffee and found his father sitting beside his wife and his son, and stood there for a moment with the look of someone who was looking at something they had not dared fully imagine before it was real. Then he crossed the room and gave Letitia her coffee and bent, and kissed her forehead and sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at his father and his son with the same expression. And the November light came through the window and lay warm across all of them. The years that followed were full ones. Letitia returned to teaching in January of 1884 with Thomas in a basket in the corner of the classroom, which the students found deeply compelling, and which significantly enhanced attendance rates for the first 4 months of his life. When he was old enough to be left at the ranch house in the daytime with Clara Fuentes, who had become a regular part of the household's daily life, Letitia taught with the particular focus of someone who had protected the right to be there and did not intend to waste it. The school grew. She petitioned the county successfully for a second room to be added, and then for a second teacher when the student population expanded as new families came to Dusthaven. She established a lending library that was open to adults in the evening 3 times a week, and organized public lecture evenings on science and history and civic matters that drew people from as far as 15 miles outside town. She helped several of the Mexican families in the community navigate the process of establishing formal land claims under Texas law, working with Gerald Oates in Careville to file the necessary documentation. This was not without opposition, but she had learned that opposition could be withstood and that outcomes over time favored persistence. The Shelby Ranch, under Reuben's increasingly primary management, changed shape too. He brought in new breeding stock and moved away from the purely longhorn operation his father had built toward a more diversified cattle business. He also, with Letitia's persistent advocacy, developed a formal arrangement with the Mexican ranch workers that provided company housing with better conditions, and a medical fund contributed to jointly by the company and the workers themselves, which Dr. Whitmore administered. Harlan resisted this initially and then stopped resisting it when the numbers showed that stable, healthy workers were more productive and less likely to leave for other operations. He was a man of numbers. Numbers he understood. Grace Pelham died peacefully in the spring of 1885, in her own bed at the age of 73, with what the doctor described as a quietly failing heart. She had spent the last years of her life with the particular satisfaction of someone who had set the right things in motion and seen them through to stability. Letitia sat with her in the last days and read to her from Dickens, which turned out to have been Grace's favorite too, and the old woman had smiled at the coincidence and said, "Of course. Any woman with sense likes Dickens." At the funeral, Letitia spoke briefly and chose to say only the true things. That Grace Pelham had built this town as surely as her husband had, that she had watched over it for decades, that when she had needed to she had produced a piece of paper from a strongbox that had saved something irreplaceable, and that Thomas Shelby, who was a year and a half old and was sitting in his grandfather Harlan's arms on the front pew, and was significantly more interested in pulling at Harlan's mustache than in the proceedings, carried her husband's name and would carry it into the future. Harlan, to his visible effort not to laugh while sitting at a funeral, maintained his composure. By 1886, the town of Dusthaven had grown enough that it warranted its own justice of the peace and a proper courthouse, and the question of who would serve as the first JP was the subject of considerable local debate. Reuben was proposed, and declined on the grounds that running the ranch left him insufficient time. Letitia was proposed, and the debate over whether a woman could serve as justice of the peace in Texas in 1886 was both spirited and educational for the town, with Letitia herself pointing out that the law did not explicitly exclude women from the position, and that several women in Kansas had already served in similar roles. The county ultimately appointed a newcomer named James Holt, a retired circuit judge from Galveston, but the debate itself had done something, shifted something in the way the town talked about what women could and could not do, and Letitia noted that with quiet satisfaction. In the summer of 1886 she was expecting again, and in February of 1887, 3.5 years after Thomas, their daughter was born. They named her Alina for Reuben's mother, and when Reuben told Harlan the name, the old man went into the study and closed the door again, and this time he was in there for 2 hours, and when he came out his eyes were red, which everyone pretended not to notice except Thomas, who was 3 and noticed everything and said, "Grandpa, your eyes are pink." And Harlan picked him up and held him and said, "So they are," and Thomas, satisfied, went back to whatever he had been doing. Alina was from the beginning a different proposition from Thomas. Thomas was watchful and methodical, like his father, building things and taking them apart and asking careful questions. Alina was quick and bold and occasionally alarming, walking at 10 months and climbing on things immediately thereafter, with a fearlessness that made the ranch hands nervous and Letitia privately delighted. "She will be trouble," Reuben said, watching his 8-month-old daughter eye a chair she intended to mount. "She will be magnificent," Letitia corrected. "Both," he agreed. Harlan adored both children with a completeness that contrasted so sharply with the cold, formal distance of his earlier years that people who had known him for decades occasionally remarked on it privately. He was not a man who had learned to be outwardly warm. That was not who he was, and he did not pretend otherwise. But he taught Thomas to ride at 3 on a small, gentle pony, and took him on the slow morning rides around the East Range, narrating the history of each fence post and water tank as though the boy were already the heir he intended him to be. And Alina, when she was old enough to understand it, received from him a gift that surprised everyone. He brought out from some deep storage in the ranch house a small set of books that had been his wife's, the same ones he had given to Reuben years ago to donate to the school, or rather, a second set that had been in a separate box all along, and he set them in Alina's room and told her, "Your grandmother read these. She would have liked you." Letitia found Reuben in the hallway after this and found him leaning against the wall with his eyes closed. "All right?" she asked. "He never talked about her," Reuben said, meaning his mother. "In all those years, not once." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "Whatever you have done to him, Letitia, do not stop." "I have not done anything," she said, "except exist stubbornly in his life until he ran out of reasons not to let me in." Reuben smiled and pulled her close and kissed her temple. "That is, in fact, exactly your method." "It is a very effective method," she said. The schoolhouse in 1887 underwent its most significant physical transformation. A second room had been added in 1884, and now, with Letitia's 5-year campaign to the county board finally yielding results, a proper new building was under construction. A 2-room schoolhouse of limestone block with a proper wood floor and east-facing windows for good morning light, and a covered porch for the children's boots and coats. The original 1879 building, the one that had been briefly and wrongly sold, was not torn down but converted into a lending library, which Letitia felt was a satisfying continuity. On the day the new school opened, in the September of 1887, the whole town came. It was a warm day with a high, bright sky, and the cedar trees along the property boundary had been trimmed back to let in more light. And Letitia stood on the new porch and looked out at the crowd of people who had come to mark this moment. The children who would fill these rooms, and the parents who had sent them, and the grandparents who had built this town, and the new families who were still arriving, drawn west by the possibility of something. She made a short speech. She thanked the county board. She thanked Grace Pelham, who was not there to hear it but whose husband's donated land they were still standing on. She thanked the people of Dusthaven who had signed the petition and stood firm when it mattered. And she said that a school was not a building but a promise, and that the promise was that every child who came through these doors deserved to be taken seriously and taught rigorously, and sent out into the world with more capacity than they had arrived with, and that she intended to keep that promise for as long as she was standing. In the back of the crowd, Harlan Shelby stood beside his son and listened, and when the applause went up he put his hands together and clapped, and Reuben saw it and said nothing and felt everything. After the crowd moved inside and the children claimed their desks, and the new school smell of fresh limestone and cedar and chalk dust settled into its permanent form, Reuben found Letitia at the edge of the yard, standing at the old fence, the one he had repaired on that long-ago August morning when they were still just a schoolteacher and a ranching man who had noticed each other. "Do you remember," he said, coming up beside her, "the morning I fixed this fence?" "I do," she said. "You drove every nail in 2 strokes. I was trying to impress you," she laughed. "You were impressing me. I was pretending not to notice." He leaned on the fence post. "We have come a considerable distance from that morning." She looked at him. He was older now than the man who had walked into her schoolyard with a borrowed hammer, the lines in his face deeper, the first threads of gray at his temples, and he was, she thought, more fully himself than he had been then, more settled in his own skin, the way people became when they were living in a life that fitted them. "Yes," she said, "we have." He took her hand, the same way he had taken it the first time, walking home from a reading evening in the September dark, carefully, like something valuable. She held it back. Thomas was 5 and Eleanor was 7 months, and the new school was full of children, and the hill country light was September gold, and the fence was solid and true. And Letitia Keating Shelby stood in the yard she had fought for, and thought that the distance from Richmond, Virginia, to Dusthaven, Texas, was not only measured in miles, but in the long, particular, difficult journey from a life that had been broken to one that had been, improbably and beautifully and without any shortcuts, made whole. The years continued to stack up, rich and varied and full of the small and large urgencies of a life built in a frontier town that was gradually, unevenly, becoming something more settled. A 3rd child came in 1889, another son they named James, who arrived in the spring with considerable energy and very little patience, and who from his earliest days preferred the outdoors to any interior space, and could be found at age 2 trying to climb the pasture fence while Thomas, 5 years older, watched from a safe distance with the expression of someone keeping careful scientific notes. Reuben took over the ranch's formal management entirely in 1890 when Harlan's heart, which had been troubling him for years, made it increasingly difficult for the old man to manage the physical demands of running the operation. This was not a diminishment but a transition, one that Harlan accepted with more grace than anyone expected, partly because he retained an advisory role that Reuben was genuine about consulting, and partly because his grandchildren took up a considerable portion of his energy and apparently suited him better than 3 decades of paperwork. Harlan died in the winter of 1891 on a cold, clear January morning, sitting in the large leather chair in his study with a cup of coffee and a ledger open on the table beside him. The doctor said it was his heart, quick and not prolonged, and given the alternative, this was considered a mercy. Reuben sat with him for a long time after, alone in the study, and Letitia did not disturb him, only made sure the house was quiet and the children were tended to. Later that evening he came and found her in the library room with Alina on her lap and a book between them, and he sat down beside her and looked at his daughter for a moment and then at his wife and said, "He told me something last month, when he was having a good day." He paused. "He said he thought he had been wrong about you. Not just about who you were, but about what it meant that Reuben chose you. He said he thought that the kind of man who chose well was more valuable to the legacy than the kind of man who chose correctly." Letitia was quiet, looking at him. "I think," Reuben said carefully, "that was the closest he was capable of coming to saying that he was proud of me." "I think so too," she said. He nodded and looked at Alina, who had fallen asleep against her mother's arm with the absolute confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt her safety. He reached out and touched his daughter's hair and then looked at Letitia. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it. For staying when it was difficult and for fighting when it was necessary and for being exactly who you are in the middle of all of it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful not to wake Alina. "You did the same for me," she said. "We did it together." "We did," he agreed and settled beside her, and the January wind moved through the live oaks outside, and the lamp was warm, and inside that room they were all of them, the sleeping child and the two people who had found each other in a dusty schoolyard on a July morning and had, through stubbornness and courage and a great deal of love, made everything that surrounded them now, inside and safe and whole. The school ran for 23 more years under Letitia's guidance before she finally yielded the teaching to a younger generation. And by that time she had taught hundreds of children, had trained half a dozen new teachers herself, had expanded the lending library into a proper town library with a separate building, and had served on the Dusthaven School Board without a gap from 1885 onward, eventually as its chair. She had also, quietly and persistently, established a scholarship fund in Grace Pelham's name that paid the normal school fees for students from Dusthaven who wanted to become teachers, funded by a small ongoing donation from the Shelby Cattle Company that Reuben had made a permanent line item in the ranch's accounts. Thomas grew up to be the ranching man everyone had expected, careful and methodical and quietly formidable, taking over the East Range operation at 20, and the full ranch management at 25 when Reuben was ready to step back and let his son carry it forward. Alina became a physician, the first woman to practice medicine in Kerr County, a fact that surprised no one who had watched her grow up. James remained on the ranch for a while, and then went north to study law and ended up working in Austin, eventually as a state legislator, which Letitia received with the particular pride of a mother who had spent decades arguing that the children of frontier towns deserved the same opportunities as the children of any city. On a September evening in 1905, Letitia and Reuben sat on the porch of the ranch house that had long since become fully and unmistakably theirs, the same porch where she had sat reading Dickens to him in the evenings of their early married life, watching the hill country sky do its habitual extraordinary thing with the light at the end of a warm day. They were in their 50s now, and the years had done what years do, taken some things and given others, and the porch was quieter than it had once been without the children's noise, though the grandchildren, Thomas had married a schoolteacher from Fredericksburg and they had 3 children, filled it up on Sundays. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" Letitia said, without looking up from the book in her lap. "Tell me," he said. "That morning you came and fixed the hinge." He looked at her. "I think about that morning often," he said. "You handed me back the screwdriver," she said, "and you said there, and I thought, here is a man who fixes things and does not need to be thanked for it in the particular way that some men need to be thanked." She paused. "I thought it was a good quality in a person." "Was it enough to fall in love with me on the spot?" "No," she said honestly. "That took approximately 2 weeks longer." He laughed, the same laugh she had known for 25 years, the one that came from deep in his chest and meant he was genuinely amused and not performing anything. "I fell in love with you when you told me you were willing to ride to Kerrville on 2 hours' notice to argue with a lawyer," he said. "I thought, Here is a woman who will not be stopped by anything inconvenient, and I want to stand beside that for the rest of my life." She set her book down and looked at him. The light was golden and his face was lined and familiar and dear, and she thought that she had been right. On that October night in the town hall, when she stood with a deed in her hands and the whole structure of her carefully built life apparently collapsing, she had been right to look at him and think, "This is not over." Not because everything would be simple, it had not been simple, but because he was the kind of man you did not give up on without a fight, and she was, as he had observed, not a woman who was stopped by inconvenient things. "I love you," she said, because sometimes the true things needed to be said plainly and without ornamentation. "I know," he said. "I can tell." He reached across and took her hand. "I love you too, for exactly what you are, which is formidable and occasionally infuriating and always, always worth it." She held his hand and looked out at the hill country evening, the cedar and live oak and the long red road, and the sky that was doing its best September work above all of it, and felt the deep, uncomplicated satisfaction of a woman who had come west with a leather trunk and a teaching certificate, and had built, over 25 years, every single thing that mattered. The hinge on the schoolhouse door was still working. She had checked it just last week. Some things, fixed with care and patience, hold for a very long time.